All right, today we're going to talk about plants. You'll probably want to print out the outline of these notes on eClass and fill them in as we go along. The very first thing we'll talk about is the evolution of plants. And when I refer to plants, I'm referring to land plants. Um, they're ancestors of plants were actually living in the ocean, like every other ancestor of every organism. And so if you think about what gave rise to land plants, take a second to think about it. And if you came up with green algae, then you are correct. So algae is not considered a plant. It's actually a multicellular protist. But they are the ancestors of all land plants. And there are several pieces of evidence to support that. Mainly the chlorophyll, the pigment in green algae is chlorophyll A and B, and all land plants have that pigment as well. And so evolving on land, there were some obstacles. All right, so for plants to move on land, they face certain challenges. Living in the ocean was rather easy. Living on land was a little bit different environment, so they had to come up with several different things. One of those is reproduction without water. Sperm, which is found in plant pollen, most of it swims. All right, so if you're a plant living in water, that's no problem because you're surrounded in an aquatic environment. Once plants moved on land, that became a problem. Support against gravity. Obviously, you're very buoyant in water, and you don't need that support against gravity. That's why really large organisms like the blue whale can live in water no problem because it's in this buoyant environment. There's no way that an animal as big as a blue whale would be able to live on land. Gravity would be too big of a challenge. So they needed to support against gravity. They needed to prevent drying up, and the fancy word for that is desiccation. All right, so once plants moved on land, one of the biggest challenges was how to prevent from drying up. All right, and we'll talk about how they actually did overcome that in a second. Obtaining nutrients. How are they going to get the nutrients? Again, if you're in an aquatic environment, those nutrients are all around you. And another thing is protecting the egg or the developing embryo. Almost everything in life still needs this aquatic, salty environment in order to thrive. And if you think about humans, for instance, that's still true. If you think about a developing embryo, it's in the amnion, it's within the amniotic sac of a mammal. All right, so amniotic fluid, that's a warm, salty environment. It has a salinity very similar to that of ocean water. And so we still rely on that. Plants some groups of plants are actually the only organism to actually completely, fully get away from that. And we'll discuss that in a second. Okay, so how did these land plants actually overcome these barriers? About 500 million years ago, that green algae colonized land, and there was selection for those organisms that have mutations that prevented them, or that allowed them to live on land. One of those things, and overcome protection from drying, from desiccation, was the development of a waxy cuticle. So if next time you're outside, go feel a leaf, it will feel waxy. Wax is a hydrophobic substance, and so therefore it prevents water from escaping and getting too much water in the organism. So waxy cuticle is one of those adaptations. Gas exchange through that cuticle. So you don't want to make a super solid seal because we still need gas exchange. Plants still need oxygen for cellular respiration, and they need carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. And so in order to exchange gases from the environment, they had to come up with these passageways through the cuticle. And if you know what those are, you would know that those are called stomata, pores in the waxy cuticle. Another thing that they had to come up with is how to transport water and nutrients from one end to the other. Again, if you're living in the water, those nutrients and water are all around you. You don't really necessarily need a transport system. You can just rely on diffusion and osmosis. But living on land, that's not necessarily the case. And so they had to come up with ways of getting water and nutrients from one end of the plant to the other. And so the way that you could do that is roots. And so the nutrients are in the soil, and so roots are going to help get those nutrients and bring them to the rest of the plant. And there are two types of vascular tissue, which we'll talk in detail about. There's xylem and phloem, and they help transport nutrients and water. But not all land plants have them. Some of them do, some of them do not. And then the protection for the embryo. Some of these plants have seeds, and seeds is just a little protective house for developing embryo, prevent it from desiccation, give it nutrients, and all the above. And so these are some of the ways that land plants overcame those obstacles that they faced when they moved on land. All right, there's four major plant groups we'll talk about, and how they're divided is based on whether or not they have seeds or spores or vascular tissue. All right, and what vascular tissue is it's basically a means of transporting water and sugars from one end of the plant to the other. And so that's going to be your xylem and that's going to be your phloem. Water is transported through the xylem and sugars are transported through the phloem. And how I remember this is that photosynthesis produces, that pH in photosynthesis produces the product that phloem, that pH again, will shuttle. So the photosynthesis products are transported through the phloem. Water is produced or transported through the xylem. So the four major plant groups, we have bryophytes. These are going to be your simplest land plants. These are going to be your mosses. They do not have vascular tissue. And so because of that, you don't really see very tall mosses. Think of a moss in your mind. It doesn't grow very tall. It doesn't have a transport system from getting it from one end of the plant to the other. And so therefore its height will be limited. And they're also seedless. All right, their sperms still swim. So because of that, they're heavily reliant upon water. And so you're only going to find mosses that are low-lying, and they're going to grow near our moist areas or areas where there's lots of water. Another one is the pterophytes. That P is silent, just like in pterodactyl. The pterophytes are your ferns. These do have vascular tissue. So imagine a fern in your mind, and it can actually grow, tall because it has support against gravity and it also has that vascular tissue. But they are still seedless. They still have sperm that swim, and so therefore they will be growing in environments that are rather moist. We have the gymnosperms, which are your evergreens. They are vascular as well, and they do have suits. All right, so they can grow in environments where they're not completely reliant upon the water for swimming sperm. They have naked seeds. And then we have the angiosperms, which are your flowering plants. These are they also have vascular tissue, so there's only a group that what does not have vascular tissue. Those are bryophytes, and they have these covered seeds, and they produce fruit and flowers. So these are the four different types of groups. And we have a tree right here, if you want to fill this in. If you guys remember what this is your phylogenetic tree. This is going to be a cladogram, so we're going to have shared derived and shared ancestral characteristics on it. So we have an ancestral protus, and remember that was a green algae. The evidence to support that is that there are plant pigments in it, chlorophyll A and B, that are also present in land plants, and so that's the big piece of evidence that supports this. We have an ancestral protus, and then there is the colonization of land. So these four clades of plants are colonized lands, and so we have our bryophytes, they're non-vascular land plants, so they do not have the vascular tissue, but they do live on that. And so those are going to be your mosses. Now, right here's our derived characteristic, this vascular system. So everything from here on out is going to have a vascular system that includes xylem and phloem, and it's going to conduct water and nutrients. And so we call these tracheophytes because they have tracheates, which are the little elements that make up vascular tissue. So right here, as we see, these are the xylem cells are actually themselves are called tracheates, and they are dead at functional maturity. So they will grow and then they will die, and the only thing that remains is the cell wall. And if you think about what makes up the cell wall in plants, it's cellulose. And so they have these little connections from one tracheid to the next tracheid. And remember those little holes in the cell wall that's adjoining another cell are called plasmodesmata. And their function is to transport water. And so if you think about the properties of water that allow that to happen, that capillary action, the combination of cohesion and adhesion, water is going to travel up. And so these three groups of plants all have tracheates. They all have xylem. All right, so we have the pteridophytes. Those are your ferns. They have vascular tissue. They have those tracheates, but they are seedless. They have spores. And then we have the evolution of pollen and seeds. Pollen is essentially plant sperm, Some people have allergic reactions to it, and we have seeds, and that's going to protect the developing embryo. And there's two different groups of those kind of plants. So we have the gymnosperm. They produce pollen, and they have naked seeds. And then those are going to be your evergreen trees. Most of your evergreen trees that you think about, your pines, those are gymnosperms. And then we have the flowering plants, and those are going to be your angiosperms. Angiosperms produce flowers and fruit, so if you ever see a plant that has a flower on it, or if you ever see a plant that has a fruit on it, that is an angiosperm. And so the flowers are actually the reproductive organ of that plant. And so we'll talk about that at a later date. There are two groups of angiosperms. There's the monocots, and then there are the dicots. And the monocots and dicots refer to the seed leaves in which you have, and there are differences between those, which we'll talk about later. But there are two groups of angiosperms, and so that's kind of an overview of the plant diversity. Here are some examples of mosses and liverworts. Notice that these are very tiny. They don't grow very far from the ground. That's because of their lack of vascular tissue. Here are some ferns, Psilotum, which is whisktail. Here are some ferns. These are some examples of members of the Pteridophyta group. And then the early pteridophytes, most of the oil and petroleum that we mine today is leftover stuff from the early Carboniferous period, which was pretty much dominated by ferns. So think about that, and that is definitely a limited resource we'll run out at some point. Here are some tree ferns. This thing right here, this is a developing new frond, and so we don't call, the ferns don't really have these things called leaves. They have fronds. And this right here, this system is called a fiddlehead. So the fiddlehead will unwind to become a new frond, and that's in the pteridophyte. So there I said, fronds are the leaves, are equivalent to leaves on the ferns, and the fiddleheads are the new fronds coming in. This is one of my favorite gymnosperms, is the ginkgo tree. We look at this, and it is an evergreen. Excuse me. Gymnosperms are evergreens, but ginkgo is the only deciduous, meaning that the leaves will fall in the fall. But almost every other gymnosperm, I believe every other gymnosperm besides the ginkgo, is evergreen, meaning that they retain their leaves throughout the year. I like this tree because it is the official tree of Athens, Georgia. And so if you ever go to Athens, Georgia, you'll see a lot of ginkgos planted all around. But this is a gymnosperm. It doesn't really look like a gymnosperm, but it is considered a gymnosperm. Here are some cycads. You might have seen these before. They have male and female varieties, just like the ginkgos do. Most all the ginkgos that you do see are male because the females produce these cones that have a flesh around them that smells really, really, really rancid. And so a lot of people don't like planting female ginkgo trees. We have the conifers, which if you think about are pine, and then we have some juniper down here. These are all examples of gymnosperms. The thing about the gymnosperms is they do have seeds. All right, that's what separates them from ferns, and they have vascular tissue, so that's what separates them from mosses. But the thing that makes some big difference between angiosperms is that they have naked seeds, meaning that their seeds are exposed on these modified leaves, or strobilia is actually what they're called, and they're not enclosed in a fruit. So angiosperms, their seeds are enclosed in a fruit, meaning that they're not naked. Gymnosperms, they do not have that fruit. Their seeds are exposed on the underside of these cones. And so there are two different types of cones. They're male and they're female cones. And so the female cones are usually what you see and what you pick up off the ground. And the male cones produce pollen, and this is usually the pollen that you see here in Georgia. All that yellow stuff that covers your car and your sidewalk and things like that, that's mostly pine pollen. And that's not the pollen that makes a lot of people sick. A lot of the pollen that makes people sick with allergies is pollen that they cannot see. But here is one of those little, if you were to take this off and then look on the other side, here are two seeds. These are two seeds for the gymnosperm. So like I said, you have male pollen, or you have pollen cones and you have female cones. And here is a picture of male pollen that's produced from this male cone, and it relies solely on wind to get distributed and get on the underside of those female cones, which is where the seeds will develop. And so that would be a female cone. Underneath this, you would find two exposed seeds, depending on the species. Angiosperms are going to be your flowering plants. They also have seeds. A seed is just the embryo that has a protective layer of tissue on it, and that has some nutrients provided for it. But the flowering plants, remember, the flowers for angiosperms are going to be the reproductive part of the tree or the plant. Those are the reproductive organs of that plant, or the flowers. And the purpose of the flowers is to, be the reproductive organs, so fuse male gametes and female gametes and produce a little embryo. And those embryos will be stored in seeds, and those seeds will be protected in fruits. And so if you've ever eaten a fruit, which almost everyone I'm sure has, what you're actually eating is the wall of an ovary. Of a flowering plant, and so that lining will thicken and make it packed full of nutrients for the developing seeds. And so here are some examples of flowering plants. This right here is your butterfly bush. This right here is orchids. All of these things, when you look at them, they're nice and pretty, and they are actually the reproductive organs of angiosperms. Once those flowers do their job and they attract pollinators and they fuse the male and female gametes, you'll have a fruit that forms at the base of that plant. And again, the fruit is just a thickened ovary. That's essentially what it is. And inside a fruit are going to be your seeds, which is going to be your little embryo surrounded by a protective layer of tissue. And so here are some different types of fruits that are basically, like I said, ovaries. And you can see that fruits come in all shapes and sizes. A lot of them are dependent upon means of distributing themselves. And so a coconut is buoyant, and so it can float in the water and then land on land and spread that way. This right here, you see these in Georgia all the time. They come from the sweet gum tree. They are meant to be sort of picked up by furry animals and distributed that way. Some really fleshy fruits rely on organisms coming to eat them and pass their seeds along through their digestive system, and so when they expel them through their bowels, the seeds stay intact, and then they have a nice little layer of manure to get themselves growing. This right here, these are seeds of maples, and so you have a little fruit in there, but they rely on wind, and so these things sort of helicopter through the air in order to get distributed. Okay, so when we compare and contrast animal and plant life cycles, it's a little bit different. If you think about animals, which is kind of easy to do, but when you look at an animal, when you see an animal, what you're actually looking at is a diploid multicellular individual. It's going to carry 2 copies of chromosomes. One chromosome set comes from the mom, one chromosome set comes from the dad. So that's usually what you look at. Now, think of our life cycle. In order to reproduce, we need some of those cells to undergo meiosis. Remember, meiosis is the process that cuts those chromosome numbers in half. So meiosis is going to produce cells that are not 2N, but they're going to produce cells that are 1N. And so we have haploid unicellular gametes. Egg and sperm for animals is unicellular. We don't have a multicellular gamete stage. And so we just have one set of chromosomes, and then those gametes, the egg and the sperm, will come together. That process is fertilization, and then it makes something called a zygote, which has 2N. And a zygote is this one cell, has 2 copies of the chromosome. In order to get to this multicellular individual, it's going to have to undergo several rounds of mitosis. And that's the animal life cycle. And you should be very familiar with that. But what I want to point out is that when you're looking at an animal, you're looking at the diploid multicellular individual. And there's no multicellular haploid stage. Our haploid stage is unicellular, just eggs and sperm. That's not the case with plants. All right, plants, you also have a diploid multicellular individual, and we call that the sporophyte. So the sporophyte has 2 sets of chromosomes, and they can also undergo meiosis. And remember, meiosis is a process in which it's going to cut the chromosome number in half, and that's going to make spores. All right, and so spores have only 1 set of chromosomes. If you ever look at the underside of a palm frond, you might see these little clusters of spores. They're called sori, and they're pretty cool. Underneath the sori are these little spring-like mechanisms that when there's water intact, they sort of spring out and get distributed in the air. But meiosis is going to produce these things called spores. Now, these spores can actually undergo mitosis. Now, meiosis cuts the number in half. It's not going to make cells that are identical. Remember, mitosis is a cell division process in which the daughter cells are identical to the parent cells. So mitosis is going to produce a multicellular organism that that's full of cells that only has one set of chromosomes, and so that's called a gametophyte. So a gametophyte is multicellular, all right, unlike our gametes, which are unicellular. So gametophyte multicellular, has one set of chromosomes, and these things can undergo mitosis to produce gametes. So gametophytes produce gametes. Gametes will then fuse, make fertilization, and once you have that, you have a zygote that forms just like in animals, and that zygote will undergo several rounds of mitosis, producing identical cells to that of the zygote and make the sporophyte. In plants, we call this alternation of generations. So we have alternations of generations. A lot of times in plants, when you look at a plant and you see a plant, a lot of times, definitely in the case of gymnosperms and angiosperms, you're looking at the sporophyte. But in some other plant groups, you are looking at the gametophyte. So that's the alteration of generation. So let's go through these different groups of plants and sort of run down the adaptations and what their dominant stage of life cycle is. And so remember, the bryophytes, the most simple land plants, they do not have a vascular system. All right, so they don't have those tracheids, they don't have any xylem, they don't have any phloem, they don't have any water transport system. And so how they get water is straight up osmosis. All right, so they have to live in these moist environments in order to get their water, and they do not have true roots. The dominant stage is the gametophyte stage. So if you've ever seen that fuzzy moss, like if you imagine a moss in your mind and it's that fuzzy green stuff, that is actually the the gametophyte stage. And so those are made up of cells that only have one set of chromosomes. The sporophyte stage are these little yellow things that you see. So that's haploid, this fuzzy green stuff. This is the gametophyte. The diploid is going to be these yellow things right here, and they're going to give rise to spores. Reproduction, they have swimming sperm, and since it's swimming, it relies on water. And so it's flagellated, it moves around through water, and they produce spores. They do not have seeds. And so spores do not have that layer of protective tissue around the gamete. They're just spores. And so those spores will sprout to form the gametophyte, and that's the dominant stage in the bryophyte plants. Pteridophytes, these are your first vascular plants. And so yes, they are vascular. They have that water transport system made out of tracheids, if you remember those. Xylem transports water, phloem transports sugar. They have roots, they have leaves, and we don't really call them leaves, we call them fronds. The dominant stage for that is the sporophyte stage. All right, so when you're looking at the fern, you see the sporophyte, that's diploid, and they have an independent gametophyte. And a lot of times you can see these with the naked eye. A lot of times if you're in the forest and you see fern, if you look underneath it, you might find something that looks like this. It's a little heart-shaped gametophyte. You can see it with your naked eye, which is pretty cool. And that's a haploid life cycle. They have swimming sperm, so they're reliant upon water. They're flagellated. And then they produce spores. And so on the underside of these little clusters are called sori, and within the sori are your spores. And these spores will sprout to form your gametophyte, which is this right here. All right, for gymnosperms, the vascular system, absolutely, they are vascular, so they have the tracheids, they have the xylem, they have the phloem, they have the roots, they have the leaves. The dominant stage, when you look at a fern, that's your sporophyte stage. It's diploid sporophyte stage. They have a reduced microscopic gametophyte, and those are going to be found on the cones. You have males and females. And so the reduction of the gametophyte protects the egg underneath these, an embryo in this protective sporophyte, which, like, again, are your cones. And that little seed is going to be protected from drought and UV radiation. And so these are sort of like one of the few types of organisms that can truly get away from water when it comes to reproduction. So they have seeds, which is, there's a reproductive barrier. You have your embryo protected by a protective layer of tissue, and they don't develop in fruit, so they are naked. And they have pollen, which is essentially the male gametophyte, which is the sperm. All right, for the first flowering plants, do they have a vascular system? Absolutely. So they're going to have the xylem, the phloem, the roots, the leaves. The dominant stage is the diploid sporophyte stage. So when you look at that, you're looking at the sporophyte. The gametophyte is reduced to the flower. and that's going to protect the egg and the embryo. Reproduction, remember that reproductive organ is the flower. We'll talk more a little bit about that in a second. But these flowers, when you look at flowers, you think of something pretty, and that's due to sexual selection. It's to attract pollinators, and a lot of times these flowers will have nectars, and that pollinators are going to help fusing the egg and the sperm. Seeds are inside the fruit. They are not nectar, they're inside the fruit. And those are going to attract seed spreaders. And then the pollen is going to contain the male gametophyte, the sperm. All right, so if you have any questions, please let me know. I hope that was helpful. Please come with questions for class that we can discuss.